Welcome to Today with Dr. K. I'm Dr. K. Whitehead, here again to have another conversation with you about some of the stories that matter. Folks, it has been a historic week as we've been watching every single night of the Democratic National Convention, waiting for the moment that happened last night when Vice President Kamala Harris, the first Black woman to be at the top of the Democratic ticket, she officially accepted the nomination. I shouldn't have been the only one in the House wiping tears. Everybody was joining in my household. Joining me to talk about it today are Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, UCLA and Columbia Law professor, as well as the author of the recently released Say Her Name and the forthcoming book, Back Talker. How are you, Professor Kim?
I'm great. Great to be with you, Dr. K.
And I'm also joined by Tim Wise, the author of 8 books, including Colorblind, The Rise of Post-Racial Politics and the Retreat from Racial Equity, and a senior fellow with the African American Policy Forum, for which Professor Kim is also a co-founder. How are you, Tim?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you both because we have been watching this together. Every night, folks, we've been on Twitter together. We've been online together. We've been on all the social medias, taking our step through this moment to try to make sense of it. And so first, I want to come to you, Professor Kim. Can you talk with us about some of the highlights of this week, things that you really enjoyed seeing on the screen?
Well, Kay, it really was a party. The Democratic Party threw a great party. And, as we're all three of us, we were enjoying it from home, having been felled by the dreaded pesky for me, COVID, so I couldn't go. So oh man, it was so painful. But then I have to say, the COVID metaphor actually helps describe a little bit of what I thought I was seeing there, because I remember after, what was that, a year and a half of just hiding out and being so scared and not knowing what's going to happen and dreading the future. When I first got, my vaccination, I was like, I wanted to go everywhere. I wanted to party. The sun seemed brighter. The trees seemed greener. The air smelled better because of that dread, because of just being underground for so long and just thinking the worst possible scenarios might happen. So being released from the certainty of the horrific likelihood of another Trump presidency to the possibility that we might live to fight another day clearly was the downbeat of that big party that we saw happening for 4 nights, and it spread to those of us in television land. So I was dancing along with Little John. I was giving shout outs as people were partying and just experiencing what the theme apparently was: the joy of the possibility, the joy of what saving democracy might really look like, the joy of not having to go to bed every night with a sense of doom that carried over. So I have to say that the producers of this event were completely in sync with the emotional undercurrent. And they figured out how to program in a way to lift it up and actually turn it into a wave. Now, of course, the real question everyone's quick to ask is, how long will it last? But can we just sit for a moment in the fact that we had a good time just seeing spirits lifted? That is the one thing that, I take forward, even though I have my criticisms. The fact that we were able to see and experience that is something that is unforgettable.
Tim, I want to come to you because to build on what Professor Kim said, I saw that as well. If I go back 4 years to when Joe Biden officially accepted a nomination, we were in the midst of COVID. So it was done all virtually, but it felt like a sad moment, not just because of COVID, but watching it on TV, it felt cold, it felt distant, it felt like it didn't speak to me. Well, last night I was at home again, but I felt like I was in the party. So it felt very much like a Gen Z, Gen X party because it was so slickly produced and every single aspect was made to draw you in and not make you feel like you were standing outside.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's striking, we all know that the convention in '08, where Barack Obama was nominated, was also a pretty joyful moment. There were a lot of tears, a lot of excitement. But it is, how sometimes if you go back and you watch a show that's 10 or 12 or 20 years old and you thought it was really HD back in the day, like you thought it was a really crisp image and you remember it in this sort of hagiographic way, but actually you look at it, you're like, is that like monochromatic? Like, is that an old black and white television I'm looking at? Because it's not as crisp. And then you realize it is, I think, the generational transfer aspect. A lot more young people. Young people were instrumental in Obama's victories, but I don't remember them being in the hall that way. I don't remember them being on the floor as delegates. I think a lot of these young people, frankly, who came into the racial justice movement back in 2020, who come out of the climate crisis movement, who've been doing really good grassroots work, are beginning to try to move into party politics to influence party politics in a progressive way. I hope that's correct. And to the extent that it is, we're starting to see them, and they have an energy that is really sort of boundless, right? So that stuck out. And the second thing, it was such a contrast to the Republican convention, which had just recently happened. Here you had a Republican convention with a guy who at that point, they figure he's got this. Like they should be celebrating. They should be the ones partying. They should have smiles on their faces and balloons and all kinds of excitement. But they had these constant scowls and frowns because the politic of the right is a politic of grievance and resentment. Even when they're winning, they act like they're oppressed. Even when they're on top of the system, they act like they're on the bottom of it. And here you've got the Democrats who, look, this thing's not over. They are still, as Michelle Obama and others said, they are still underdogs in a lot of ways, if for no other reason than the way that the Electoral College is structured and how difficult it is systemically for Democrats to win in that environment. And yet they acted happy and joyful in spite of what they know are still some significant odds. And the folks that had all the odds in their favor acted like the world was coming to an end. I thought that was a very significant contrast and one that is likely to help the Democrats, because people, when they think about politics, don't want to be miserable. They've been miserable for a long time. There, that 4 years that Trump was president, I think it made a lot of people miserable to think about politics, to talk to their relatives. Now we want something different. And I think the Democrats delivered that.
Tim, let me just add to that because, the contrast is amazing. And once you put that extra point on it, why shouldn't they have been joyful? Because they were likely winning at that time. And I think, I want to go with a soft stroke here, but there is something about the underbelly of white Christian nationalism that has a kind of, jaundiced eye towards the kind of joy that is elevated through, sort of pop music, through, music and its long, long, long history in this country coming from the bottom. What's so fascinating about it is that, as you could see, there was like a different song played by every state, recommended by the state, 50 songs, and we knew all of them, right? And it just gives you a sense, perhaps, of the difference between a certain kind of aesthetic, right? Just the way the place looked, the way people were occupying their bodies, the way they spoke. If there is a contrast that can be visual and aesthetic, between the autocratic, fascist leaning direction that the MAGA, movement represents, and this popular, from the bottom, widespread, kind of cacophonous, space that was created by the Democrats. If nothing else, just looking at those two pictures tells you a lot about the culture of the two parties.
Well, and that reminds me of something, when you're fighting for freedom and a liberation type capacity, it is a joyful thing. And there's a long history of that. I mean, there's a history of enslaved people using music as protest, using it as resistance. When you think about the civil rights movement. These are folks, we're at the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer, as we've talked about often this summer. And when those folks went to Mississippi, they knew they were facing death. I mean, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered right at the beginning of Freedom Summer. And they knew that every day that they went out to register voters, every day they went to teach in the freedom schools, every day that they went to try to build the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as an alternative to the all-white segregationist party in Alabama, in Mississippi at the time, they knew that when they were doing that, they faced death. They had lost their colleagues and comrades already, and they knew that they faced death. But at night, when they went back to the homes where they were staying in the state of Mississippi, Black folks' homes where these white volunteers and Black volunteers and Latino volunteers and Asian volunteers who were coming mostly from the North, they went back and they partied at night and they sang and they demonstrated joy. There's something inherently joyful about small d democratic politics. There's something inherently joyful about fighting for freedom. And there is something inherently joyless about authoritarianism, which is what the other side has to offer. And that is one of the reasons that I think it's so important that the Democrats leaned into that, because it demonstrates a different way, not just of voting, but a different way of being and of living. And that, I think, is what people really want to feel, not just on election day, but the other 364 days out of the year.
It was also a week for family. I was thinking, as different parents have reached out to me about how they kept their children up every night to watch what was happening at the DNC. It just reminded me of my childhood. We stayed up and watched Roots, and it had a very different impact on us to sit with our parents watching Roots every day and feeling that there was no hope, feeling really sad, not understanding why I was crying because of all the violence, all the oppression, and no one helping us to make sense of it. It was just sitting with us. It was a different contrast this week. There were also sister watch parties everywhere. I think that the first time that I had girlfriends texting me going, "Do you see her nail polish? I love her hair. I love her suit." It sounds really superficial, but for sisters to see themselves up there and start thinking about some of the other things besides just the issues, it was a different moment, which I want to touch on before we go into the issues.
Yeah. I think that all of that, so I had it on Twitter, so I was seeing running commentary. I was watching it on C-SPAN because, as I said on Tuesday, I got annoyed at all of the, moments where you really wanted to hear what someone was saying, and somebody in a control booth decided that they wanted to go back to the studio. I'm like, really? There are messages being created here, and I want to know about it. So I was watching that, and every now and then I would watch the, commentary. But yeah, people were talking about everything from, Michelle Obama's, long ponytail, to Oprah's purple. It was a little bit of everything happening at the same time. Like I said the other day, it's a party with a purpose, and nothing can, take away from what kind of an anchoring moment this is, and what kind of moment that I hope it will be for young people who watch this. I thought your analogy to Roots was absolutely, on point, because I remember that, I was in high school, and it was a thing that everybody watched. I think it was on for 5 nights, in a row, and it became the conversation that we had, at school, on the school bus, at the lunch table. The thing that does still stick with me about it, though, is it took us through the entire arc. It took us through, the encounter and the middle passage, and then ended with, the struggle to pick up and move and go to a better life. So there was this upward trajectory, and I feel like the hope framework was designed to give us that. It was designed to give us, now it's time for us to go and do something. It's not that this is just going to come, and it's not just our birthright because we're American, but this is the thing that we're fighting for, and this is the thing that should be the imperative for all of us moving out of this moment. That, I thought, was just pristine, nicely executed. I feel the spirit as well. At the same time, there's some, I'm sure we all have some things that we kind of wish.
Now, I want to get into that, right? So Tim, one of the things I thought about in preparation for our conversation is I thought about the first debate with JFK and Nixon, and how JFK was pressed in his suit. Nixon had just gotten off a plane. He looked tired. He looked rumpled. He was sweating. And people that watched that, the first time you're watching a presidential debate, they automatically said Kennedy won the debate, because they were looking at what he looked like and not
Kennedy?
necessarily Kennedy, and not necessarily focusing on what he said. Well, people who heard it on the radio felt very differently. They're like, oh, wait a minute. I don't know what's going on here. I heard something different. So moving away from the images, because they were designed to draw us in and make us cry and give us hope, can we talk about the issues, some of the things that you thought were really missed opportunities to have more engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were some missed opportunities, particularly to connect some dots for people that need to be connected. Look, we are just 4 years removed from the largest political uprising of any kind in this country's history. 20, 23 million by some counts, people in the streets for racial justice, to address systemic racism, the disproportionate majority of those being white, a lot of them young people. And that's not to say that you would expect the Democratic Party or anyone to just make a convention all about racial justice. That would be silly. There are lots of issues, but they're connected. And I thought there were opportunities to make those connections that the party, for reasons that I'm not 100% sure on, did not take advantage of. You know, the fact that we're talking about how the convention hall looks like America is very true. But if we know the history of the party, we know that just 60 years ago, had it not been for Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democrats coming and demanding a seat at the table, had it not been for Reverend Jackson in 84 and 88 and the Rainbow Coalition doing the same, doing the grassroots work, had it not been for the insurgent campaign of Shirley Chisholm in 72, the odds are that party would have remained a somewhat better, but nonetheless old white boys party. So let's lean into that history. Let's make the connections. Let's actually demonstrate as a party. I'm speaking for them now, not for me, because I'm not part of it. But they, you know, it seems that they could have said, here's how we've become better. We've become better because people who cared about racial justice connected that to the project of democracy, connected that to economic opportunity, connected that to jobs and healthcare and housing and all of these things. And this other party that we're running against started out with really noble anti-racist principles, and look what they've done. That would have been a great opportunity. One more that I thought of, you know, they talked a lot about Kamala Harris, when she was the attorney general, prosecuting predatory lenders. I think 7 people last night talked about that. Well, that's great. We ought to prosecute predatory lenders. But would it have killed the party to make the point, even just once or twice, that we've gone from redlining, which sought to keep Black and brown folks out of homes, to predatory lending, where they don't mind getting you a home, they just don't want you to be able to afford it? Like there's a historical arc that could have been demonstrated to remind us of where we've come from. And that is so important, particularly at a moment when we have people on the other side who were trying to erase our understanding of the historic precedent of systemic injustice. So it's not that I want everything to be about race, but when race is sort of the topic that shall not be named, it's sort of the Voldemort of the convention, that becomes a little bit of a problem moving forward for the purpose of movement building and I think momentum.
I'll come to you, Professor Kim, with the same thing.
Yeah. Well, you know, of course, I too noticed the rather crabbed way in which race was discussed. And again, I agree with Tim. You know, the point isn't that everybody needs to address it. The point isn't even that, you know, necessarily the candidate has to, but it's the contrast, I think, that we notice. Think about how many stories, moving stories, we heard about the consequences of the Dobbs decision. Think about how many times we heard about the consequences of gun violence. I'm not saying that that's too many. I think it was important because policy at the end of the day, particular people-driven policy, has to be grounded in empathizing with the consequences of not having that policy. And so it seemed as though there was a recognition that we needed to be granular in detail about the many consequences. So we heard about what happens when a woman miscarries and can't get the medical help she needs. We heard about people who wanted to have children. We heard, you know, about someone who was killed by one person with a gun and someone who was killed in a mass massacre. We heard about each of the different dimensions of that. And then we also heard about how Project 2025 was designed not only to prevent us from addressing those harms, but actually extend those harms. So people were able to connect the dots between the way that this injury is actually experienced on the ground, the policy that makes that injury visit those people who were victimized by it, and then what the new administration would do to double down on that, so that it all became part of the big story about why we need to elect this ticket. It was seamless. It worked. At the same time, there are other freedoms that we are losing: the freedom to know our history, the freedom to read the books that we want, the freedom to protest. All of these, which were part of 2020, there really was no effort to be granular or to tell a story about what happens if we lose this freedom. The one exception, and I thought it was a powerful one, and I was glad to see it, was to see what was once the Central Park Five, now the exonerated five. We were able to see what happens with criminal injustice systems, and that was linked to Trump, who wanted to execute these young men. So that was a thread that was important to be able to articulate. But that's not the only thread. The consequences of reproductive freedom on Black women in particular, who face disproportionate mortality through the entire childbirthing experience, that might have been said. We had school teachers. We have school teachers who have lost their jobs because they can't teach the story that was mentioned the day before by Oprah, Ruby Bridges. Where is the effort to tell that story, tell people why it matters, and why they need to push back on these divisive concept laws, this censorship, and elect someone who has promised to uphold the freedom to learn? So you just got a sense that the capital, the emotional capital behind racial injustice is not what it used to be, wasn't what it was in 2020, and maybe further be losing the value that we need in order to drive public policy.
Right, because there's a very open question as to why you wouldn't bring on, when you're doing all those little spotlighted 1 minute, minute and a half stories, why would you not bring on, let's say, a teacher who has been there, as Kim said, teachers that have been terminated for teaching material that is found to be divisive, and then they could have had that person tell that story and connected that to Project 2025, which says that if they get their way, they will pass a national, quote unquote, Parents' Bill of Rights that would allow parents, if they are offended by that story that Oprah Winfrey told about the New Orleans Four in the wake of desegregation, having to put, dark paper over the windows so snipers wouldn't kill the children. You could imagine a white parent saying, "Oh my gosh, this offends me. This makes my child feel bad." And Project 2025 would let them sue. So they could have done the story piece, which is powerful narrative about the teacher that's fired. And then they could have connected it to the policy piece, which they were talking about in other contexts all week, but that just got left out. And it got left out enough to where you start to wonder whether that was just an oversight or whether it was deliberate. I'd hate to think it was deliberate. And if so, I'd love to see the strategy or the polling that says you can't talk about the censorship of accurate history. I don't believe that there's any polling suggesting you need to do that, but they made that call. And that was, disconcerting. It doesn't take away all the good, but it does sort of hang there as the spoiled fruit in the corner of the room, or the rotting meat that we just don't want to quite address.
Professor Kim, there's an image in the New York Times today of Vice President Kamala Harris standing on a tightrope. So she's in high heels and a pantsuit to kind of show us that she had to do a very delicate balancing act last night. She talked about the freedom to love, but not the freedom to learn. She lifted up and said, we're going to continue to support Israel. And she mentioned Palestinian self-determination, but didn't lean too far into it. Everything was kind of this balancing act. And I feel like that's been the tightrope all week long, where you want to
And it's going to be the tightrope of the campaign, and so that really raises a question. First of all, of how the rope got constructed, right? That's a perhaps a deeper conversation. But now that we know there is a tightrope, what should we as stakeholders in a multiracial democracy do about this? How should we think about it? And so I don't know what the polling says. I don't know what the advisors are saying. So we can only speculate, and also be reminded that advisors are not already always right. Shall we return to 2016, right? When the advisors basically thought Clinton had it, in the pocket, and they were way, way, way wrong. But I will say that even if it is, the case that uh, uh, Harris's ability to speak to that center, the undecided, the Republicans who they're trying to woo, would be made more difficult by saying, and when you come over here, here are some other people that you're going to have to learn how to deal with, because basically your party has been built on vilifying these groups of people. It could be that, all right, you can't do it in a 20-minute speech. You might not even be able to do it a lot on the road. Although, again, I will say that from what we know from the Obama campaign, the idea that the entire campaign has to be colorblind and that's how he got elected is not really an accurate story. The ground campaign, the door-to-door campaign, the targeted messages to different voting constituencies had to take up race in various ways, either to disabuse people, of whatever barrier the guy with the funny name created for their ability to see that actually his policies were more consistent with their interests than the other guy, or whether it was actually mobilizing communities of color to actually get out and do it. Those messages had to be somewhat tailored. So the question now is that tailoring, happening? Are those infrastructural needs to actually get the vote out through targeted recruitment and messaging? Are those infrastructural dimensions being funded in the way they need to? A big complaint that we've heard a lot from Get Out the Vote organizers is that a lot of the resources don't actually come to the folks who know best the constituencies, who know how to sit down and talk to somebody about these issues. And some of those folks who know it better may not be the advisors sitting up in the room somewhere saying, say that, don't say that. So I think that is really what the question is. And for folks like us and, folks who are in the racial justice community, we've got to figure out how to help people respond to some of these arguments, how to connect the dots, how to say you don't get to save this democracy without dealing with the racist underbelly of those who want to destroy it, the way resentment is being weaponized to undermine the democracy. We're going to have to figure out how to speak to that, how to speak to DEI. So that's the work that we have to do from now until November, providing that information, those stories that, we didn't see last
and to historicize it a little bit, when we don't tailor those messages and we don't speak to each constituency in the way that, we obviously realize you need to speak to those ex-urban and small town white folks in a lingo that they can understand. Nothing wrong with that. You have to meet people where they are. But what about speaking to Black and brown communities and immigrant communities and not just the quote unquote middle class, but the working class and poor of all races in language they can understand? When you don't do that, we know what happens. 1996 when Proposition 209 got rid of affirmative action in California? The strategy on the ground coming from the top down, from the advisors, and they had polls to justify what they did, said, we don't want to talk about race. We're just going to talk about how affirmative action is important for white women, because we figure we can get the white women with a gender specific message, but only if we ignore race. Washington State tried the same thing 2 years later with I-200. And guess what? In neither case did it work. Not only because it didn't convince white women the way they thought it would, but a lot of black and brown folks stayed home because they honestly came to believe, well, this isn't really about me at all. This is just about jobs for white women. Like, this doesn't even affect me. When I started out in Louisiana in 1990 in the campaigns against David Duke, we had very high paid, still very prominent Democratic Party consultants telling us, don't talk about the fact that Duke is a Nazi because we need racists to vote against him too. Aside from the moral problem with that argument, it wasn't practical, because when you don't talk about it, guess what? Black turnout was much lower than white turnout, because a lot of black folks were like, well, I mean, I know he was a Klansman and he was a racist, but I guess it's not a big deal anymore because they're not talking about it. So the turnout was down and Duke got 44% of the overall vote. In 1991, a year later, when we decided to lean into the racial component to talk about the unacceptability of racism and white supremacy, not only did white turnout go up, anti-Duke turnout, but black turnout went through the roof and was equal to white turnout. So you can't just, do what sometimes they try to do, which is let's go to the independents and the undecideds and the soft Republicans who aren't MAGA and get them. You need to do that. But you got to also remember, as we've talked about all week on the show, dance with the ones that brung you. And that's a different tune that you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And sometimes I think that they think they can't do that, even though I'm pretty confident that they can.
Professor Kim, I want to come back to you because I'm remembering a moment from the 2016 DNC when the mothers of the movement came out on the stage to support Hillary Rodham Clinton, and people were chanting Black Lives Matter. And I know your work, you're coming up, I believe, on the 10th anniversary of Say Her Name, and the work you've done, and with the title of your book and the talking with the moms of the movement. Well, they were not saying her name this week. They did not say the name Sonia Massey.
Sonia Massey, no.
Not at all. I mean, they mentioned, Heath Ellison mentioned George Floyd for just a second, but even the governor did not. So can you talk a little bit about the way in which even race was centered back in 2016, thinking about Black Lives Matter, that it was just completely pulled out this week?
2016 and 2020. Look, here's my overall, worry. It's one thing to make a big tent and you bring in more material, right, to cover everybody, so there really is room for everyone. It's another thing to just take up the stakes from one side of the tent and just move it, right, to accommodate the new folks, but take away the shelter from the folks who had already been there. So, one can't say that just what we saw in programming is enough to confirm that this is happening, but it is telling us that we are going to have to struggle to make sure that the effort to appeal to the sensibilities of those Republicans who are now homeless does not end up fully erasing the moral imperatives around racial justice that have been the calling card for the Democratic Party that frankly helped get Biden elected in 2020. The only way, though, that that's going to happen, and this is going to be a challenge because it was a challenge for us during the Obama period, we're going to have to be able to be proud and excited about the possibility of this glass ceiling breakthrough, and at the same time be willing to hold this administration accountable for some of the basic values of racial justice, whether it's racial justice in education, racial justice in employment, or racial justice when it comes to policing. And that, frankly, is not clearly being expressed here. I think we all understand that, there's been blowback against Black Lives Matter. There's been a, blaming of Black Lives Matter for, the midterm losses. There's been, a lack of cohesion among Democrats about what to do about this ongoing problem. And yet the problem is ongoing. People have been killed at the same rate now that they were in 2020. So we've got to be able to be advocates for our own interests, even if that advocacy means that we have to lobby and pressure people who look like us, people who are friends, of ours, people that we admire. This is still about politics. And if we're not going to make demands, if we're not going to change the equation on the ground, then of course it's easier to say, okay, you guys move a little bit off to the side so we can make room for, these new voters coming into the party. We got to say, no, it's not going to go down like that. With respect and a lot of love, this is our party too. And we're not going to allow our issues to be erased and silenced.
Right. And when we don't do that, we actually give, I think, we empower those on the right who think that everybody on the left only cares about identity politics in the narrowest, crassest way, right? They're the ones who would say, well, you only wanted Obama because he was a black guy, or you just want people to vote for Kamala Harris because she's a black woman. And what we're actually saying is, no, that has never been enough. It can be both important and symbolically valuable, just like Jackie Robinson being the first modern era black baseball player in the major leagues was important, but there was still systemic problems with segregation more broadly that needed to be addressed, not only in professional sports, but throughout society. Barack Obama breaking that part of the glass ceiling was vital, but the idea that we would then be satisfied with that is not what anyone I know in progressive circles or on the left more broadly, or certainly within the racial justice movement is satisfied with. It's always been about what are going to be the systemic changes. And even Barack Obama back in 2008 at various points along the way said, you need to make me do these things.
Do it.
He said, make me do it. And I think a lot of us were, and this didn't just happen with Obama, people did this with Clinton. I remember in 92, people were like, he reads the same, liberal magazines that we read, or he talks to some of the same liberal journalists. So we're okay.
He plays the saxophone with sunglasses.
He plays the saxophone, right? Exactly. Or Barack Obama comes out and does "Dirt Off Your Shoulder" and it's a Jay-Z reference, and it's like, oh well, he's cool enough now, and all of that stuff. I'm not saying it's meaningless, but it's not what we're fighting for, and it's what the right says we're fighting for. So we don't want to give that the oxygen that it doesn't deserve, that we're just about, brown faces or black faces in high places. We are about systemic change. That's what those folks were fighting for in the abolition movement. It's what they were fighting for, fighting Jim Crow. It's what racial justice advocates have always been fighting for. Dr. King's dream speech did not include anything about a black president. He didn't talk about that. I'm sure he would have been thrilled, but that wasn't part of the dream. That march on Washington that everybody plays the one clip from was a march for jobs and freedom, right? That's what the sign said, a march for jobs and freedom, not about one individual or two individuals or 10 individuals, but millions of people with fully equal opportunity for the first time.
I want to ask you, Professor Kim, as we come back to you, I'm trying to think of this as a card game. So you have your trump cards, you have your second level cards. I grew up playing spades in the South. And and they taught me early on, get rid of the cards that don't matter.
Yeah.
Back it up. So
Kitty, put that stuff that and so we were laughing about this, like, feeling like, the cards that we're most familiar with were the ones that kind of, end up being, purged from your hand. So we know, and I'm using Trump as sort of a double meaning. The Trump cards that they showed us are clearly reproductive rights. That's a big Trump card. They're holding on to it. We heard something about it every night, right? Project 2025, that's a big, Trump card. We heard something about it every night. They told us from the first night, we're going to hear about this, again and again and again. We heard about the attack on democracy. We heard a little bit about that every night. That was a common theme. And we heard about Kamala as a prosecutor, going after, the big businesses, going after, traffickers. So we heard it. So those are the four kind of Trumps, right? Then, the second suit that they held on to a little bit, LGBTQ issues. So every night there was something, it didn't go in deep, but we saw representatives and we heard people, talking. This is what my family looks like because of changes in the law. So there was at least avatars for those experiences. So that card, was in the mix. And I guess one could say, to a limited extent. I mean, I might put this in the kitty. Um, Global, environmental, degradation that came up not nearly as much as you would think, given the fact that we're looking at a planet coming apart at the seams, but it's in there, right? So there are these, the main suit and then your offsuit. But then I would say the ones that got thrown out on the table, clearly, the voices of the Palestinians, the thought that there wasn't one person that they could give space to talk about that suffering. And it's not as though there aren't Palestinian American elected officials who are supporting this ticket, who could have given voice to that, in the same way that we heard from parents whose son is still, a hostage. Humanizing the issue is always the first step to creating responsive public policy around it. So the inability for the Palestinians to have anyone humanizing that, it surely is one of the cards that, got left on the table. And, as we've been saying, the attack on, racial justice, the so-called anti-woke movement, all of the ways that it's going after what little is left of the infrastructure in institutions to create equality, going after DEI, framing the histories that DEI is meant to address as a divisive subject that cannot be taught by teachers. That was not one of the freedom songs that you heard much about. And so I would say that card, is left on the table as well. So when you find yourself potentially, in the discard pile, what they're valuing the most in this game. Now, I said earlier that maybe their data are telling them to play this election game. These are the two suits you have to have, and that might be true. But it's up to us to make sure that those cards on the table that got left there are not wiped off the table entirely. There are other ways that we need to be able to address these issues in the electorate so that this is not a moment where, the tent, to switch a metaphor, has just moved off of us and we have no longer a home for these values and interests.
That's right. I mean, I think we have the opportunity to pick up those cards that have been discarded, and they may or may not be ever played the way we'd like them to be played by a big, Democratic Party, for instance. But, the Democratic Party also wasn't playing those cards in 1964. And then Fannie Lou Hamer and the MFDP show up and they say, well, we're going to play these cards and we're going to keep playing them until you hear us. And grassroots activists have always, change comes, and this is so important for young people to know, especially when their schools don't teach it and are being increasingly told not to teach it. Change doesn't come from the top down. It doesn't come from the party apparatus down. It doesn't come from the president down. It comes from the bottom up. And so we should be saying, okay, y'all are going to do what you're going to do, perhaps, and we're going to try to nudge you and prod you to talk about these issues. But whether you do or not, we are going to talk about them. We are going to talk about them with our neighbors. We are going to talk about them in our churches and mosques and synagogues. We're going to talk about them at the PTA meeting. We're going to show up at those school board meetings where the right is trying to ban books and punish teachers, and we're going to demand something different. We're going to connect the dots, even if the other folks aren't doing what we'd like them to do. Because you can sit back and you can complain about this big, powerful institution not playing the game the way you would, or you can decide to lean into your own power, organize with other people, and say, we're going to do that. We're going to do that part. We hope you'll come along. We hope you'll follow our example. But whether you do or not, we're going to make sure people understand the racial implications, for example, of Project 2025. The fact that they want to remove the words diversity, equity, inclusion from every law, regulation, or rule that the United States government passes. The fact that the attack on critical race theory, on CRT, on DEI is mentioned over 100 times. The fact that 5 of the authors are overtly racist, a couple of them overtly white nationalists. They might not talk about that, during the 4 days of the DNC, but what's keeping us from letting people know that? Because there might be folks thinking, well, what does this have to do with me? I don't really get it. It seems very complex policy. It's not complex when you've got white nationalists helping to craft the next Republican presidential agenda. So we can talk about those things even if they don't want to. That's our job to do.
No, I appreciate that and the way you laid it out. I was thinking about something, Professor Kim, that Governor Westmore said about how you can't love your country while lying about its past. Great moment, great line. We've all quoted it, but when we started asking people just in our conversation, well, what past is he talking about? What exactly did he mean? A missed opportunity. And
Yeah,
there was,
totally. And I think perhaps a misunderstanding about the histories that this generation, and I would say even broader than that, that most people have access to. You know, a lot of people don't really understand. And this is one of the things that I think was really important. I said this the other day about Oprah Winfrey's comments. They don't realize that segregation existed in our lifetimes, right? You know, just a decade after Ruby Bridges integrated her school in New Orleans and the New Orleans Four, Kamala Harris was integrating a school in Berkeley. So that's shocking on so many different levels. Like, what? It wasn't just the South? No, it wasn't. What? It wasn't just, you know, a century ago? No, it wasn't. That segregation, that expression of racial subordination, white supremacy, of course, if people still are alive who were shaped by that, still walk this earth, and the impact, the consequences of that are still very much part of our contemporary reality. Not being able to talk about it or just winking contributes to this notion that you know, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, all we're talking about is getting people with a different complexion or a different gender, not removing some of the obstacles and the barriers that recent history has actually created. So if we don't show how to talk about that, if we're satisfied talking about race solely in terms of, I'm going to vote for Kamala because she looks like me, that's the kind of diversity that the right wing disparages. That's the kind of diversity that allows people to think that somehow, you know, Kamala Harris is less qualified than Trump is. We have to be able to historicize, as they started to do with Trump, how he got a head start, you know, what the preferential treatment, and that's what I like to call it, not affirmative action, the preferential treatment that he got that put him in a position where he could fail forward multiple times. I want to reserve affirmative action for the idea that if we take equality seriously, it's not just lip service that we have to give to it. We have to take affirmative steps to see where the obstacles and barriers still are, rethink those institutions and those structures so that the true potential of people who are held behind them actually has a chance to flourish. That's what real affirmative action is. And that's what people have to learn how to talk about when they are responding to the attacks on Kamala and anyone else as a DEI candidate.
now, Tim, I want to come back to you in our last few minutes here. I like to give people something to walk away with. I mean, what should they do next? Maybe something they should think about, something they should read, a video they should watch, but give people some marching orders, some homework to do, because we do have the next 70 or so days in front of us. It's going to be a race, a sprint to what we're calling our finish line, our North Star here, November 5th. So what should people do next? And I'll come to you after.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I think, you know, I would direct people to the AAPF website. We're going to be putting up some amazing videos of some of the sessions we did at Critical Race Theory Summer School, where a lot of the topics we've talked about today, we go into in quite a bit greater depth, and some resources are provided there as well, both books and other writings and social media material that folks can check out. Obviously, if folks want to understand the way that this sort of dancing around race doesn't work, my book Colorblind, which was written during the Obama years, goes into detail with a lot of research to back it up that shows that it's not just ethically a challenged position, but it actually is not the way to go about building progressive multicultural democracy. And then I would just say the final thing is, and it goes back to what Kim was just talking about. This attack on Kamala Harris is going to be all about, oh, she's a DEI candidate. We need to practice rejecting the framing of the other side on whatever issue it is. And the framing around that is you're a DEI candidate, meaning you're not qualified. Rejecting that framing means, no, actually, DEI is about qualifications. It is about opening the door qualifications. And the way people can lean into that is tell your own stories. If you have, in fact, had doors open because of things like affirmative action and DEI, rather than running from that, lean into it and demand that those two things, merit and DEI, are not opposites. And if you're white and maybe a male who hasn't benefited from what we call affirmative action, be humble enough and honest enough to acknowledge some of the preferential treatment that you have received, and talk to your neighbors about that. Talk to the people you go to church with about that. Talk to your family about that, because part of the problem, the reason that the right is able to get away with their framing, is that no one wants to acknowledge that we've had help. No one wants to acknowledge that there have been people that have helped. Oh, we might give credit to our parents and maybe a teacher back in third grade, but nobody wants to admit that we didn't earn everything on our own. It's not just white folks that want to say that. Black and brown folks want to believe that too, in a country that tells you that's what makes you qualified, is you're a rugged individual. Where none of us are rugged individuals. We've all had help. And if we could learn to be humble about that and tell those stories, that framing that the right relies on wouldn't work anymore.
And so I come to you, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. Short of taking your class at UCLA or Columbia, what do people do?
So I'm just going to amen what Tim said. Check out our website. As of September 1st, you can register for our CRT summer school, where most of the issues that we talked about over this week, we go into depth in summer school. So if you want to learn more about Project 2025, all of the ways that it threatens to undermine the progress that we've made towards a multiracial democracy, that's the place to go if you want to find out about how, our friends who sometimes miss the boat have contributed to the challenges that we're facing about elevating the anti-preference defense of affirmative action, the divisive concepts, or the anti-woke assault. If you want to learn more about that, you can come and check us out. And we're going to be rolling out things over the course of the electoral season. So check us out to continue to be informed, sign up, and talk to people. So we make this stuff available so you can go out to talk to folks, whether it's in the beauty parlor, the barber shop, the dinner table, prayer meeting. Now is the time for us to do something, and that do something means talking to people so they know what's at stake, they have the tools to fight back, and they show up when they need to show up to make their voices heard.
Thank you so much, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and Arthur Tim Wise. Thank you for your time. And folks, it's Today with Dr. K. I'm Dr. K. Wise White. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve you in this way.